Tonight's speaker needs little introduction to this large audience, who I can't see because it's gone so dark. It's Monsieur Timothy Verdon, who is originally from America, but has been living in Florence over 50 years. An art historian of great standing, joined the Curia of the Duomo as a working priest, is the director of the Museo delle Opere del Duomo, and oversaw their extraordinary transformation in recent years. And when he, as if that wasn't enough to do, he also lectures at Stanford University Study Abroad program, and presumably lots of other things I don't even know about. It's a great pleasure and indeed honor to welcome back to the British Institute of Florence, Monsieur Timothy Verdon. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the invitation and for the very warm introduction. Actually, I no longer teach for Stanford University, and so having enormous areas of leisure at my disposal, I accepted the invitation to come and speak to you this evening. I know that the rule is that lectures here are in English. The title you see on the screen, though, is in Italian, because the lecture I'll give is one that I prepared at the request of the Bishop of Pescia and gave in the cathedral there this summer, when the painting about which I'll speak this evening, Raphael's Madonna del Baldacchino, was loaned by Palazzo Pitti to the cathedral. And the reason for the loan was that the painting had actually stood in the cathedral for almost 200 years. And I'll explain that as I go through the talk. At all events, what I want to talk about is Raphael's development as a painter in the new humanist style. The Madonna del Baldacchino is actually his last major work in Florence. He left it unfinished because in 1508, while he was still at work on the large panel, Pope Julius II called him to Rome to join Bramante and Michelangelo in the extraordinary adventure of the High Renaissance. That is to say, in those works of architecture, painting. There was to be sculpture, but of course Michelangelo was asked to interrupt work on Julius's tomb in order to paint the Sistine ceiling. At all events, in 1508, when Raphael goes to Rome, he leaves this painting unfinished. The painting, as you see it at Palazzo Pitti, is this. It is an altarpiece. And at the end of the lecture, I will remind you that Raphael would have thought of it in the first place as a work that would be seen normally by people going to Mass. Mass would be said at an altar right below this. I'll show you the altar where Raphael thought the painting would go. And while the talk does not devote a great deal of attention to that aspect, I'd ask you to keep it in mind, because I will return to it at the end. It's an aspect of so many of the masterpieces of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries that is too often forgotten. That they were, of course, made to be beautiful objects. They, of course, have enormous historical and art historical interest. But in the first place, in the minds both of the painters and of the patrons, they were functional objects within a religious system. They were what you saw when you took part in Catholic Christianity's centermost rite, the Mass, the Eucharistic liturgy. I'll return to that at the end. The painting is large. It's 279 centimeters tall, 215 centimeters wide. It shows the Virgin Mary and Christ child. She is seated beneath a baldacchino, a kind of suspended canopy, the drapes of which are opened by angels, The baldacchino is suspended in what looks like the apse of a church with beautiful coffered decoration. It's all supported by handsome columns that look as if they may well be in Florentine Pietra Serena, beautiful Corinthian capitals. Mary is seated on a throne elevated above the ground level by three stairs, one simply to allow her to get into position. The other two are a permanent platform. It's a composition we'll see that Raphael and others used at this time, nothing especially new there, except for the particular elegance with which the artist depicts it. Around Mary's throne are four saints. Let me identify them. Reading from your left to your right, you have St. Peter. You can just make out the keys in his left hand. Next to him and looking at him is St. Bernard of Clairvaux in a white Cistercian habit. On the other side of the throne with a staff is St. James Major, patron saint of pilgrims, whence the staff. And then at your far right, looking out at us and guiding our attention toward the main subject, Mary, with the Christ child, you have St. Augustine in cope, a bishop's mitre, and with a book in his lowered left hand. In front of the throne, you have two rather sweet looking angels who are together looking at a scroll as if they are reading some passage from Scripture. All of this is probably well known to many of you, and many will be familiar with the painting. It is one of his masterpieces there in Palazzo Pitti, despite its unfinished condition. What you may not know, what really surprises many people, is that the way we see the painting today in Palazzo Pitti is not quite the way Raphael painted it. I'd like you to look again at the upper part of Mary's baldacchino and at that apsidal concavity with coffered decoration. All of that has been added. In fact, if you look carefully at the slide, I think you can see that the upper, what would it be, about eighth of the slide is slightly darker than the remaining 7/8 of the image. And that's because when the work was cleaned, they were careful not to bring the added part to the same level of finish as the original parts. What Raphael originally painted was the same thing, but more monumental in a way, because more in your face, as we might say today, without that suggestion of spatial depth, without that additional height. It's a fact that I tell you mainly because it's a curiosity, because it's of interest, and it is part of the history of this particular work. It's even rather amusing. Why was an upper section added to an already famous work by Raphael? It was added for reasons of decoration. This painting had been originally made for a Florentine family with an altar in Santo Spirito, the Dei family. But since Raphael left it unfinished when he went to Rome, it never got to the Dei altar in Santo Spirito. He probably took the unfinished work with him to Rome, where a Tuscan prelate, Baldassare Turini, from Pescia, saw it, fell in love with it, bought it, sent it back to Pescia, and put it on his family's altar in what now is the Cathedral of Pescia. Then it was simply the principal church. That's why I was asked to do a lecture at Pescia on this work. Palazzo Pitti loaned the work to the cathedral so it could once again stand on the altar that had been made for it when it was purchased, probably in the 15 teens or so, by this Pesciatino prelate in Rome. He was the datario, one of the high functionaries of the court of Pope Leo X. Why was the upper strip added, however, to this painting? It was added when a noble, indeed a princely collector, the eldest son of Grand Duke Cosimo III, Gran Principe Ferdinando, there you see him in a contemporary portrait, decided, in this case, as in other cases well documented, that the painting was too fine to remain in a church where connoisseurs did not easily have access to it. He wanted to incorporate it into the growing collection at Palazzo Pitti. And indeed, he was working with a very distinguished decorator. The man's title was actually Guardarobiere of the palace, that's to say, warden or wardrobe keeper of the palace, the man responsible for all of the stuff in the palace, Giacinto Marmi, who, for Gran Principe Ferdinando, redesigned the hanging of the pictures in all of the main rooms. And Giacinto Marmi had a very particular approach to this task. He laid out on paper, we still have his drawings, the geometric arrangement of the frames as he wanted them to be in each room. And then, when he'd gotten the basic geometry of the room down, he looked for pictures to put into the frames. So the frames are part of another story, part of the story of the redecorated rooms at Palazzo Pitti. We're in the 1690s here. And then they located the paintings to put in the frames. Raphael's original version of the Madonna del Baldacchino was just a bit too short. And so Gran Principe Ferdinando called an artist named Niccolò Cassano from Genoa, who then made a career for himself in Venice, but also worked in Florence as a restorer, to add a piece, and therefore to paint the upper portion in such a way that to the uninformed eye, or even to the informed eye, it would appear to be Raphael. He was correcting Raphael, my goodness. But that's what happened to the painting. Actually, the same that you see it in the room where it hangs in Palazzo Pitti in its corrected form, in the size frame that Giacinto Marmi had decided should go on just that wall. The same thing happened to another painting now at Palazzo Pitti, and it is this altarpiece by Rosso Fiorentino. Actually, it's the very altarpiece that the Dei family finally commissioned in 1522 for their altar. They said, well, that painting by Raphael is beyond us now. It was never finished. He's taken it to Rome. It's now gone to Pescia. We need something for the altar. So they commissioned Rosso Fiorentino to do an altarpiece. And the altarpiece that he does is not the one that you see today in Palazzo Pitti. This photograph, again, was made after a cleaning some years ago. And I think you can very clearly make out a line of separation between the whole upper part of the panel and the lower parts. It was, again, a case of a frame too big. And so the need to add was the same restorer who added to Rosso Fiorentino's painting. The original painting was really rather transgressive, very unusual for a work of the 1520s, in that, like a modern newspaper or magazine photo, it simply cuts things off at an unseemly height. There's a bishop's mitre just cut off. The top of the painting almost meets Mary's head. Parts of the bodies of the saints are outside the visual field. This was very unusual. And so it was decided to make it a somewhat more normal painting and to give it the size necessary for the frame in its room in Palazzo Pitti. It's in the next room to the Madonna del Baldacchino. Here you have Raphael's original version without all of the upper additions, but I'll move back and forth between them. That's not the real point of the talk. Raphael's painting, I said, was made for an altar in Santo Spirito, the altar of the Day family. And here in a photograph, you can see their altar. It is the one to your right of the door into the monumental sacristy, above which you have the organ. So at your right, you see a gilded wood frame. And in the frame, you have a copy of Rosso Fiorentino's painting that I just showed you. Because when Gran Principe Ferdinando bought these things, of course, he paid for a copy. His argument was usually, this painting is suffering from the humidity in the church. Let me have a good modern copy made, and I'll look after the original. Lovely man. And of course, he never became Grand Duke. He died beforehand, but his collection was magnificent. You see that the altar is relatively tall. In fact, all of the altars in Santo Spirito are relatively tall. They are, in this part of the church, all 16th century altars. And this is going to be one of my points of departure in discussing Raphael's painting. Raphael does the Madonna del Baldacchino at a moment when there is throughout Italy, but especially in central Italy, in Tuscany and in his native Umbria, a change in taste, in decorating taste for churches, where previously altarpieces had been much smaller. They suddenly become taller and taller. By the 17th century, some of them will reach 5 meters height, not in Florence, but in Bologna. But the idea seems to have been to fill more and more of the believer's visual field. As I say, the works were meant to be seen when people went to Mass. And so here, as your attention wandered from the rite itself, your visual field was entirely filled by the beautiful painting. Raphael's Madonna del Baldacchino is, in fact, the final statement in a development in his style that had begun about 4 or 5 years earlier. Here is an altarpiece that he did for a woman's convent in Perugia, Sant'Antonio of Perugia. It was desired by the nuns of that convent and paid for by members of the Colonna family. It's known as the Colonna Madonna. It's now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It is considerably smaller than the Madonna del Baldacchino. It's little more than 2 meters tall. And that includes the tympanum at the top. So the actual square or slightly elongated square, rectangle of the main panel is relatively small. The need to make the altarpiece bigger to occupy more of the visual field, it was a matter of taste, is satisfied here by the addition of an upper tympanum in which they put a 40 or so year old God the Father. That's unusual. It was a taste in Florence. He wasn't quite the Ancient of Days as he would later become and had earlier been. But he's this middle-aged gentleman giving a blessing, holding an orb, flanked by angels. The actual scene, though, on the altar is again Mary beneath a baldachin, Mary beneath a kind of canopy, Mary seated on a throne. Here it's the structure of a throne that supports the baldachin. Mary's throne on these steps, and then the throne surrounded by saints. So the Madonna del Baldacchino, which he paints between 1506 and 1508, really develops things that he was already working with here in 1503 and 4. Here you see that there are 2 women saints, St. Peter and St. Paul, left and right, but then there are 2 women saints because it's made for a convent of women. And a very unusual feature, if you can make it out in the slide, the Christ child is fully dressed because, and it is almost bizarre, the nuns insisted that the Christ child in Mary's arms not be nude, not be nude. I would say that's carrying chastity to an extreme. At all events, the clothed Christ child interacting with the small John the Baptist and all of that. This is Raphael in 1503 and 1504. About a year later, he did a more modern version of the same kind of altarpiece. It is known as the Ansidei altarpiece. It's now in the National Gallery, London. It's a little bit taller than the small Colonna Madonna. You see, though, that it still has the kind of throne with a canopy above it. The saints here are reduced to two. The rest of it is very similar to what we just saw in the Colonna altarpiece, with the difference that Mary's throne is now inside a building, inside what we suppose might be a chapel. There's a large opening right behind the throne, so we get bits of landscape to right and left, but the whole show has been brought indoors as opposed to the Colonna altarpiece. If you see them both together, I think the similarities, but also the differences become clear. And so what I'm saying is that when Raphael comes to do the Madonna del Baldacchino, he is developing, he is modernizing a number of ideas he's been working with for several years, one of the objectives of which is to create a greater sense of monumentality. Another objective of which I'm going to suggest is to create that monumentality by excluding nature. You see how much more of nature you get in the earlier of the two, and then how much less you get in the later here. When we come to the Madonna del Baldacchino, there's no view of nature at all. Mary has become genuinely a monumental figure. She's entirely enclosed by this noble architecture, a kind of apse, since he was thinking of it for the altar of a church by Brunelleschi. We can say he is adding in his painting the kind of apse that in fact actually exists in each of those chapels designed by Filippo Brunelleschi at Santo Spirito. So it's a very interesting case of a later painting trying to harmonize with the existing architecture for which the painting was intended. What makes Raphael's painting so particularly interesting is the baldacchino, or to be more exact, the movement of the baldacchino. The other two baldacchini were attached to absolutely rigid thrones. The one at your left, the Colonna Madonna, does have a curve to it, but it's so tightly clamped onto the vertical back of the throne that you don't feel a great deal of movement. Then in the Ansidei Madonna, it's all as rigid as can be. When Raphael comes to the Madonna del Baldacchino, the baldacchino floats in space. It's not attached to the throne. And these marvelous angels lift the draperies to reveal Mary to us. Those angels, let's look more closely at them, are genuine masterpieces. They are his first works in the style that he will develop in Rome, in what today we call the high Renaissance style. The beauty of their bodies, the fluidity of their movements, the wind flowing through their golden locks, the ecstatic gaze on the face of the angel at your right, and the shapely grandeur of the completely mobile bodies. All of these things are completely new. Raphael gets the idea for floating angels from works he's seen in Florence. He would have seen the San Marco altarpiece by Botticelli of the early 1490s. where you see Mary being crowned in heaven and four saints below commenting this fact. But if you can make it out in the overall image, Mary in heaven is ringed, is circled by a band of dancing angels. He'll use the same angels in the Mystic Nativity now in the National Gallery in London. Let me show you a detail of Botticelli's angels, and again a detail of one of Raphael's angels in the Madonna del Baldacchino. The idea for the angels who give movement to the otherwise rather static upper part of the tall altarpiece comes to Raphael from what he sees in Florence, but where Botticelli in the 1490s was still very much a 15th century artist, an early Renaissance artist with these slender figures, with rather busy drapery that doesn't truly model bodies, and indeed the bodies are hard to find beneath all of the drapery, and so on. Raphael, as I said, is moving in a different direction. However, my point this evening is that the Baldacchino Madonna really is the moment when Raphael not only puts into service what he has learned in the 4 years he spent in Florence, but begins to change it. Now, the movement and the sense of inspiration, of ecstasy, of spiritually inhabiting a very different realm that we see in Raphael's angel is probably still a fruit of the spiritual atmosphere in Florence in the late 80s and early 1490s, the years when Savonarola succeeded in bringing much of the city to a condition of spiritual conversion. Savonarola was considered to be directly inspired by the Holy Spirit. Here's a detail of a print made for one of Savonarola's pamphlets, in which you see the Holy Spirit emitting those flames that he emitted at Pentecost upon the apostles. You see the scene is set in Florence. There you have the dome of the cathedral in the background. The whole woodcut for Savonarola's Dialogo della Verità Profetica, dialogue on prophetic truth, shows Savonarola beneath the Holy Spirit in conversation with 7 wise men of different cultures. There are some with Arab headgear and some with Greek Orthodox prelates' hats. There's a man with what is probably meant to be a Jewish headpiece. So Savonarola discussing with the 7 sages of humanist history what it means to be invaded by the Holy Spirit. The dialogue on prophetic truth is an effort to understand how the freedom that God gives human beings can coexist with the kind of divine possession to which the prophets were subject. Prophets like Jeremiah make it clear they would have preferred not to be prophets because they knew it didn't pay very well, that there'd be a lot of hostility to prophets, but that God was too strong for them. God, in a sense, forced them to be prophets. And so Savonarola is talking to these 7 wise men about human freedom and God's will, which is expressed by the Holy Spirit. The prophets are called by the Holy Spirit. Savonarola was thought of as directly inspired by the Holy Spirit. It's probably that Raphael has come into contact with, and that suggests to him an inner condition, a spiritual state such as that which I've called to your attention in the Angels and the Madonna del Baldacchino. We'll return to that. Another work that he would have seen in Florence was the altarpiece by Filippino Lippi for a branch of the Florentine government, the Consiglio degli Otto in Palazzo Vecchio. This is a work of 1486, where again you have Mary on an elevated throne, the child, 4 saints around her, And then in the upper part of the altarpiece, angels are actually a bit closer to Raphael's, who are carrying flowers here above Mary. Let me ask you to agree that Raphael probably went to see these works. His reason for coming to Florence was to learn from what the Florentine masters had done. Remember that born in 1483, he was still a very young man when he came to Florence in 1504. He was 21. And he'd come, as Manzoni would later do, to dip his laundry in the Arno, to Florentinize his style. So we can assume he saw these things. Look for a moment at the figure at your far left in this painting, St. John the Baptist. It's made to the Florentine government, so of course we have the patron saint of the city pointing to the Virgin, St. John the Baptist, and look at the figure in the comparable position in Raphael's later Madonna del Baldacchino, the figure who leads you into Filippino's altarpiece, St. John the Baptist, and the figure who leads your gaze into Raphael's later altarpiece, St. Peter. You can easily see what I've already mentioned, this dramatic change in the way of conceiving the body. In Filippino, it was a late 15th century artist, but still 15th century entirely. St. John the Baptist has what Vasari will later call that kind of academic dryness, that stiffness, great deal of anatomical information there, but there's no flow. The body is too thin. The detail is too pronounced. It's an old-fashioned work, whereas in comparison, a few years later, well, Filippino's altarpiece is 1486. Raphael's Baldacchino Madonna is 1506 to 8. The actual painting is done in 7 and 8. St. Peter has become bigger. He's become more ample. His body forms are not revealed, but you can clearly sense the muscular grandeur of the body beneath the draperies. Raphael has seen something that dramatically changes his style, and what he has seen, almost certainly, what explains his evolution in this work. This is the painting where you start to see these large, high Renaissance figures. What he has seen is the statue on which Michelangelo was working at the same time Raphael was painting the Madonna del Baldacchino for the Dei family. He's seen the St. Matthew, commissioned in 1503 by the Opera del Duomo. It's now at the Accademia, but it's still the property of the Opera del Duomo. And it's actually carved by Michelangelo in 1505 and 1506. Michelangelo, too, will leave that St. Matthew unfinished because he's called to Rome. So Rome is starting to get in the way of Florence, is it not? Rome is emerging as the new center of contemporary art. However, before Michelangelo went to Rome, he did the St. Matthew. Raphael has seen the St. Matthew. Michelangelo's already down there in the Eternal City in Raphael's last years in Florence. But Raphael has seen the St. Matthew, the pose, the turn of the head, the evocation of Hellenistic sculpture. It is thought that Michelangelo might already have seen the Laocoon, the great Hellenistic masterpiece, or Roman copy thereof, depending on your point of view, that was unearthed in the early excavations of the Domus Aurea in Rome in January of 1506. At all events, the savor and the afflatus of ancient classical sculpture certainly invades Michelangelo's St. Matthew, and that's what explains the change in Raphael's style. So what I'm presenting this evening is a Raphael profoundly indebted to these Florentine years, in whose development the Baldacchino Madonna is an absolutely pivotal work. Another work that he had probably seen not yet finished, but at least in drawings and models, was the work commissioned from his fellow Perugian, Umbrian, I should say, Donato Bramante, in Rome for the courtyard of San Pietro in Montorio, the so-called Tempietto. It would not be finished until 1514, but the project is already ready in 15234. The idea of the curves, of the movement projected by that convex curve of the Baldacchino in Raphael's painting, which Raphael plays off against the concave niche in the architecture behind the Baldacchino, creating a dynamic spatial dialogue between these opposing but complementary forms. That was to have been the case. Bramante's drawings make it clear that that's what he intended at San Pietro in Montorio. This wonderfully cylindrical small temple was meant to stand in a perfectly circular courtyard. It was never done in the courtyard, but we have the drawings. Raphael probably had seen those. It's sometimes thought that it was Bramante who persuaded Julius II to call Raphael to Rome. So the two already knew each other, we assume. At all events, that helps us take the step that I've been leading you to throughout this lecture. Bramante's Tempietto, which you see there at your right, was, of course, a kind of dry run for the Great Commission that Bramante wanted from Julius II and got, the commission for the new Basilica of St. Peter's. Here is Cristoforo Caradosso's 1506 medallion commemorating the laying of the first stone of the new Basilica of St. Peter's, which on its verso, on its back, shows you Bramante's project, two bell towers, ziggurat-like bell towers, with something that looks in the foreground of the building like the Tempietto, and then an enormous Pantheon-like dome, very different from what Michelangelo would then, much later, in fact, realize. I show you this to invite you to enter the excitement around the great projects. Julius II, here he is on the recto of the same Caradosso medallion, looking a bit plump. He would later grow a beard that hides all of that jowl. But there he is in 1506 when he commissions the new St. Peter's from Bramante. He commissions from Michelangelo the tomb, which commission he will later change into the commission for the Sistine ceiling. And then he calls Raphael. The Rome to which Raphael is called is a Rome for which his fellow countryman Bramante and Michelangelo, in whom we know he was deeply interested, had preceded him, had prepared the way, and what we see in Rome is his amazing capacity to adapt his style learned from his father and from Pietro Perugino to the absolutely new grandeur of art made for Julius II, the art of the Julian High Renaissance in Rome. Here is Julius with his beard a few years later, seated in front of a niche rather similar to the one in the Madonna del Baldacchino. It's one of the frescoes in the Stanza della Segnatura, in the so-called Raphael rooms, the stanze, which were Pope Julius II's official apartment, the apartment where he received important visitors. Here you see him impersonating a medieval pope who approves a rewriting of canon law offered him by a scholar. But next to Julius II in this Raphael fresco of about 1510-11, You have a plump cardinal, he's at your left looking at the Pope there, who is no one other than Lorenzo the Magnificent's second son, Giovanni de' Medici, made a cardinal at 14 years of age, but money does miracles. But he took it seriously within the parameters of that office at that time. At all events, Giovanni de' Medici, who will become one of Raphael's great patrons, when, after the death of Julius II, Giovanni de' Medici is elected Pope with the name Leo X in 1513. He, of all these artists, Bramante will already be dead practically by that time, but Leo X, a Medici, really preferred Raphael to Michelangelo, and the whole latter part of Raphael's short life is dominated by the figure of Leo X. That fresco, though, which I'm giving you more historical information than you perhaps wanted, is in the Stanza della Segnatura. If you look at the window with the shutters closed, it's directly at your right of that window, and so it's next to one of the two main walls in the Stanza della Segnatura, which got that name only rather later. Originally, it was the Pope's private library. So the lower part of the walls, where in the later 16th century, caryatid-like figures and simulated bronze reliefs were painted, had bookshelves with Julius II's considerable personal library. That's where the Pope received visitors after the enfilade of grand rooms leading to this arrival point. But on the wall that visitors saw as they entered the room, the large wall that you see more to your right in this fresco, was one of the two great works in the room. The other one, as you know, of course, is the School of Athens, facing it with the great ancient philosophers. This is the so-called Dispute on the Holy Sacrament, painted by Raphael before the School of Athens between 1509 or 10 and 11. And therefore, one of his first major works in Rome after the Madonna del Baldacchino in Florence. It was one of the early works in his Roman success. And here, again, I call your attention to the way in which he uses flying angels in the upper part, and then curves, the way he creates movement with this absidal cloud platform on which Old Testament prophets and New Testament saints are seated, flanking the central figure of Christ, Mary, John the Baptist, and so on. What he did before leaving Florence, the Madonna del Baldacchino, is the direct preparation for what he would do in Rome in the following years. If we look at the two together, I think you can sense that it's always the same artist. He's working within a vocabulary that he's building, that he's defining, and he is evolving in the way in which he uses curves, the way in which he uses geometric forms, here circles, and so on. The Madonna del Baldacchino is a pivotal work in Raphael's development. Let me conclude, though, with a word on the probable meaning of the altarpiece. Obviously, while for Raphael, all of these considerations that I have tried to put into light had some importance. Creative people think, or not even think, they instinctively move in these directions. They are always developing things that interest them, that they find beautiful, that they find meaningful. But of course, the painting was supposed to mean something to others, to non-artists, and the Dei family, for their altar in Santo Spirito, almost certainly talked to the priests who run that church still, the Augustinian order, much more important in the early 16th century than it has become since. The Augustinians may have suggested, for example, the iconographical emphasis that the new altarpiece for their church should have. And I think that the key to that emphasis is probably found in the saints who flank Mary's throne. One is St. Peter. We've seen him already. And so part of the story is going to involve the official church, is going to involve the Vatican, is going to involve the approval of the Holy See. Because I believe that the real issue was a theological one and a disputed theological issue for which the church then was waiting for a decision of the Holy See, waiting for Rome to speak, to say, this is the correct interpretation rather than that. Rome would not actually make that difficult decision until 1854. So it took its time to reflect on the question, which was the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. The idea that she was conceived without the stain of original sin. Now, it was a question disputed in the Middle Ages. One of the disputants was St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and so to have him right next to St. Peter, looking as if trying to persuade Peter to adhere to his interpretation of this dogma is interesting. On the other side, you have St. James, and the precise reason for his presence is not entirely clear, although in the letter of St. James, there is a reference to one of the internal questions within the dispute, which has to do with sin and death. The letter of St. James, chapter 1, verse 15, or perhaps 16, says that once one has sinned, one is doomed to die. Once one has sinned, one is doomed to die. Death, which is not part of God's original plan for Adam and Eve, comes into the picture once they have sinned. So part of our discussion has to do with sin, and indeed Immaculate Conception means that Mary is without even that original sin inherited from Adam and Eve, with which all human beings in traditional Catholic belief are born. That could explain the presence of St. James. But the presence of St. Augustine, who of course was believed to be the founder of the Augustinian order, is most important because he is perhaps the first of the great early doctors of the church to insist upon the fact that in Mary's case, one cannot speak of sin, where for every other human being, even the holiest of saints, there's always some history of sinfulness, for which penance is done, for which pardon is given, and so on. In Mary's case, you cannot even introduce the subject of sin. So Augustine, in a sense, was seen as the initiator of the dispute. Of course, Augustine didn't really explain how that happened. And there was a complicated theological problem here because all of Christian theology insists that God sent his Son, Jesus the Christ, into the world because the world was entirely in sin and needed to be saved. And so Christ came to save sinners. If Mary was conceived without sin, then she wasn't saved. This is a medieval dispute. The Aristotelian logic underlying what to us seem like very strange conclusions is part of scholastic debate method, but it's a real question. If Christ came to save sinners and his mother was without sin, what happened? How did that work? Now, no one was really able to answer that clearly. The theory had developed in the earlier Middle Ages that Mary was actually born with original sin like everyone else, but that God extinguished it immediately. Extinguished it immediately. So there she is, a split second of sin, and then it's removed. Because he wants a sinless woman to be able to say yes to his invitation to bear his son. So they have their cake and eat it, as it were. Mary did have original sin for that split second, but then it was removed. In the early 1300s, 1308 or so, a Franciscan from Scotland, Duns Scotus, had another idea. He said, no, in Mary's case, she was preserved entirely from sin. So even when she was conceived in the womb of her mother, St. Anne, there was no trace of sin. The first position was called corrective, because she had sin and it was corrected. The second was called preventive. God prevented her from ever having any sin. And this became the framework of the debate that raged in the 15th and 16th centuries between the Dominicans and Augustinians, who were maculists. They said she did have the stain for a split second. And the Franciscans, who were immaculists, and who ultimately won, because the official definition finally given in 1854 is the preventive one. God prevented her. All of this is interesting at Santo Spirito, because the Augustinians were very much involved in this dispute. And a few decades after Raphael's painting, the Torrigiani family, for their altar in the same church of Santo Spirito, would commission an artist, Pier Francesco Foschi, we're in the 1540s, to do an Immaculate Conception altarpiece. There wasn't yet a standard iconography. And what's interesting here is that Mary, in this altarpiece of several decades later, but on the same theme, is shown, as it were, assumed into heaven, where God wraps her in a mantle, wraps her in a blue mantle, clothes her with heaven, so to speak. But at the foot of the altarpiece, right below saints who are again disputing this whole question, with scrolls in their hands, with biblical texts that they cite in their arguments, you have a man who is not really sleeping, he's dead. And that's Adam. You can see his animal skin there. The death of Adam is the proof that sin leads to death. Mary does not die. The Christian tradition speaks of her dormizione, her dormition, Mary falling asleep and then being assumed into heaven. But it doesn't really speak of Mary dying. And so the idea is to show the woman without sin being lifted up and clothed with heaven, whereas sinful man has died because he was sinful. And that helps us locate the dispute in its Florentine version there in Santo Spirito. But there's more to it, because they had to say how Mary could be conceived without original sin, when the only way people are pardoned from sin is through Christ's passion. Christ suffers the passion as an adult. So how could she, before he was born, many years before he was born, or she was being conceived in the womb, how could she be preserved from sin when the only way you can be preserved from sin is through the blood of Christ offered in his passion? And the theologians were up to this task, obviously. They said that the merits of Christ's passion were anticipated in the case of Mary. And from the point of view of theology, this is absolutely possible. There's no time in God. We live in time, where there's a first and a second and a third, a beginning and an end. In God, everything is present always. But this was the argument. And so the reason for which Mary can be preserved from sin or at least her sin can be extinguished at the moment of her conception, because that was probably the actual view of the Augustinians, is that Christ would later die. In her case, the merits of his death, his saving death, are anticipated. And I would remind you that the altarpiece of the Dei family in Santo Spirito, on the left side of the church as you move toward the altar, was something you then saw just a few meters before you got to the altar area, where at the above the main altar there was a very famous crucifix, famous for us. It's not clear it was famous at that time, that had been carved in the 1490s by the young Michelangelo for the prior of Santo Spirito, who gave him lodging and allowed him to study the corpses in the hospital then attached to Santo Spirito. It is the youthful crucifix of the 1493 or so by Michelangelo, very unusual because of the extreme youthfulness of the Christ figure. He's an adolescent Christ, not a 33-year-old man. It's a connection that I think even Raphael could have made. I didn't bring the slide, but in Italian art of the 14th and 15th century, there are often Madonnas and children in which clear allusions to the future crucifixion are made, both to underline the fact that Christ coming into the world accepted his vocation, his destiny to die on the cross, but also when in paintings you see the Virgin adoring her baby child, and then there's some clear allusion to the baby's future death on the cross. It is a way of saying this woman has been saved from sin by that future death of her son. Raphael's Madonna of the Baldacchino in this Augustinian church was probably meant to vehicle some of those messages. And again, I would urge that the moment when all of this would have been clearest was the moment when the youthful virgin and her child were seen right above the elevated host at Mass, on which then, as now, very often, there was an imprinted image of Christ's death. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We'll just get a bit of light up. There we go, so we can see each other. And I'll ask Sarah to put the zoomers up on the screen so you can see them as well. And as always now, we move into the question and answer. The rules are the same as always. If you're in the room and want to make a comment, ask a question of Monsieur Timothy Verdon, put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone. You need the microphone so the Zoomers can hear us. If you're on the Zoom and you want to intervene, you can put something in the comment and I'll read it on your behalf. Or if you're feeling bold, you can unmute and we'll hear you in the room. So, anyone want to get started? I've got just one comment, Timothy. Looking a lot at the Raphael painting, my view was he's not very good at hands.
It's unfinished.
It's okay. Unfinished. He's forgiven.
You're lacking at these 2 layers of paint that you added, where that kind of detail.
Okay, that's the point, because the hands look a little bit crude, and Peter's in real danger of dropping his book, just for starters. Anyhow, a flippant comment for me, just to break the ice. Anyone in the room want to get into the conversation? Whilst you're thinking about it, I'll read a message from Diane Archibald, probably in Canada. Yeah, we'll come to that in a moment. Thank you for highlighting the relationship between architectural elements of Brunelleschi's design for Santo Spirito and the significance of the proportions of Brunelleschi's application of Roman arch and the dynamic spatial relationship between the architecture of Raphael's Madonna, a truly three-dimensional perspective. That's Diane reflecting on your comments. There was somebody about that? I'll bring you the microphone straight away.
Given the complexity of the theological discussion about Mary's conception, immaculate or otherwise, moment of sin versus whatever, how much of that conversation and the selection of the saints and the positioning do you think the artist was informed of? Generally, an artist approaches, you paint. I mean, you got a lot of things to think about when you're painting. Was there a team that came by, every 2 months and said, okay, well, now I think you need to do this or you need to do that? So can you sort of explain the theological discussion versus the technical process of the painting and compositional and identification of those saints with features, et cetera, et cetera?
Very good question. I think today we tend to reduce the concept of the artist in comparison to what it was in the Renaissance. We think of them as technical executors, certainly with their own artistic interests, but probably not informed about the complexities of the subjects that they're asked to create. We would really do better to not call people like Raphael simply painters, but sacred painters, because the main commissions that artists sought, the commissions that would allow their works to be seen by many people, were for works of sacred art. After professional theologians and the clergy, painters were probably the people best informed about not only the Bible stories, but also the theological questions, because that was their bread and butter. That's what they were called to do. What they did had to be beautiful. It had to conform to Orthodox theology. And if they could, within the parameters of orthodoxy, introduce some new element, they were appreciated precisely for that. So you're talking about a public that in some degree participated in what to us seem extremely abstruse theological debates. And you're talking, in the case of the painters and sculptors, about artists who certainly possessed all of the technical equipment necessary to do what they were called to do, but who also had to know this other material, because that was part of the evaluation process of what they did. That if you look at the cases where we have, for example, the case of Benedetto da Maiano, an inventory of the books found in his studio when he died in the early 16th century, it's amazing the number of books of spirituality and scriptural comment that he had. So the working assumption has to be that artists did have a good deal of information. And then in addition, we assume that when a work was made for a church, and particularly an important city church run by an order of intellectual monks, that there was communication. In the case of Masaccios Trinity, impossible to think that the Dominicans of Santa Maria Novella did not horn in and somehow help the artist understand this mystery of the Trinity, and so on. I hope that answers.
Jan's further comment was, even with a rogue like Caravaggio.
Well, Caravaggio was a rogue. Why? Because he slept with the wrong people and killed someone. The New Testament says that Christ did not come for the healthy, but for the sick. Caravaggio is a great master of spiritual art. He was brought up in the Milan of St. Charles Borromeo. He was brought up was trained in a studio where all they did were religious works. He would have learned these things. That was part of what you learned. You didn't have to believe it, but you were expected to know it, because that's where you're going to make your career in interpreting this stuff. In his period, there are more and more other kinds of art. There are kinds of genre art and mythological art. In Raphael's early career, the only subjects that can really make his career are the religious ones.
I've got a couple of comments on Zoom, but before I read them out, I also draw your attention, Zoomers, to Sarah's gentle reminder that it's much appreciated if you make donations, because Zoomers are allowed in free. Everyone in the room here is coughed up front. So the Zoomers are encouraged to make contributions for whatever they can afford to help keep this wonderful lecture series going. Thank you. Moving on to the two questions in the comment from Christine Wilding. Thank you, as always, so very interesting and erudite. I suddenly wondered if there was a reason why St. John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene are so often depicted in a similar style, gaunt and ragged. Then there's another one from Ursula Brennan. Was there a plan for a specific altar frontal to go with the Madonna del Baldacchino? Richard Blackburn answers the Magdalene and Baptist question by saying they were ascetic saints.
The second question is the easiest one to answer. No, we know of no plan for an altar frontal. It's a very informed question because at Santo Spirito there are several late 15th century altars for which not only the main image, the altarpiece, was made, but also an antependium, an altar frontal. In this case, there's no evidence of that, so no. The Mary Magdalene, John the Baptist question is one that interests me a great deal because we at the Opera del Duomo Museum have Donatello's extraordinary statue of the penitent Mary Magdalene. And near it, in the same room, I went out of my way to position a 14th century triptych with, as its central figure, a John the Baptist who is similarly gaunt and clothed not in his own hair, but in animal skins. That gives you much the same impression. Certainly, the point of similarity is that they were both preachers of repentance. Mary Magdalene, who in the Western Christian tradition had been that sinful woman that Christ pardoned for her sins because she loved much, or prostitute, but reformed. Then early Christian legend says that after Christ's ascension, she went to live as a hermitess in the south of France, really not far from Marseille, a life of prayer and fasting. Now, fasting in the south of France is particularly difficult. But she has always been thought of as a woman who was able to completely change her life. And one of the very early examples, because she's of the same generation as Christ, basically, one of the very early examples of Christian asceticism, of the choice to live a life of renunciation. And she would have seen, if the legend is to be believed, remember the medieval term legend did not mean something legendary in the sense of fictional. It meant something that you should read. It was the Latin gerund. And so while it doesn't claim to be entirely true, it's something that you should know because it contains truths. So if she did choose that life of renunciation, it was not only in penance for her past life, it was also to align her new life with the Christ who had died on the cross. That's why in the museum I have aligned that statue with the dramatic 14th century crucifix that was in the baptistry with her originally, but which is also a key to understanding the subject, why an artist would show this woman who you imagine as once having been beautiful and beautifully dressed and so on, clothed only in her long matted hair and emaciated, and yet finding spiritual peace. It's a remarkable psychological study. In Florence and in other cities, there were convents of women who had been prostitutes, who changed their lives and became nuns. And so the appeal of Donatello's statue or Filippino Lippi's famous little figures of Mary Magdalene and John the Baptist was also part of people's lived experience. Many people would have known some of these women, some perhaps in their former profession, who knows. But there was a sense of admiration for the spiritual courage and strength of a woman who could so radically change her life. And indeed, Donatello in our statue shows the emaciated Mary Magdalene with very well developed biceps. And you'd say when she's not fasting and praying, she's out there at the gym, at the palestra. But he does that because this was a topos of spiritual literature. A woman of great courage, of great character, was often called a mulier virilis, a manly woman. I know you can't say those things today. I wasn't here this evening. But what they wanted to do was say that a woman who is capable of those virtues that you normally associate with the male sex, can be called a manly woman, mulier virilis, virile woman. And that's what Donatello is doing in giving her this kind of muscular look. So the points of contact are well known to Christian legend and Christian spirituality, and in Florence in particular were important. I believe the penitent Mary Magdalene appears already in the Duecento in Florentine art, and recurs and recurs and recurs, because she becomes the female version of John the Baptist. She becomes the female version of the city's male patron saint. And when in the 18th century they changed the decoration in the baptistry, put in that Baroque machina that we now have at the entry to the museum, was put in 1722 and removed in 1911 in a process of sbarocchimento that went on in many churches. When they did that, they had a marble plaque carved to put beneath the Mary Magdalene, saying that the Florentines were still deeply devoted to her. So they've changed the whole appearance of the baptistry. She remains, and they put a plaque to insist that they're still very devoted to her. I love that.
Okay. Not a false answer. All right. We could chatter with Timothy Verdon all evening, and we can continue the conversation over the glass of wine, unless anyone's got a bursting urgent question now. Gone. Okay. So, sorry, did you want to? Yes, we got one, but just before we go. Just in time.
Thank you for the lecture. Thank you very much. Does the Baldacchino also resemble or point to the Madonna being the first tabernacle of the New Testament? Because you also see in many churches, Florence, but in the whole world, that there is always this Baldacchino over the tabernacle or over the altar. Yeah, thank you.
Marian theology, what in fact is technically called Mariology, is the most fluid form of Christian theology, where with Christ, the early church councils oblige you to remain within very specific parameters. The Marian material invites poetry. The way in which the church has talked about Mary is often drawn from the Psalms and Old Testament passages. It's more midrashic than Thomistic. And so with Mary, there are always multiple levels. I didn't talk, as I should have, more about the Baldacchino, but that's part of the story too. Yeah.
Okay, and I think probably that's time to wrap it. But before we go for wine, and thanks to our season sponsors, Castiglione del Bosco, I also want to thank very much the sponsor for this evening's lecture, Susan Angelastro, who's with us here somewhere, I hope. Thanks, Susan, it's much appreciated, and to all the other sponsors for the Wednesday lecture series, which on whom we depend. And then last but certainly not least, thanks so much, Monsieur Timothy Verdon, for a wonderful lecture. Thank you.